Welcome to New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. Diane Sayre is an independent candidate for the United States Senate for the race of 2022, running against Chuck Schumer. What's going to happen tonight is that we have a symposium that will feature Diane Sayre, Paul Gallagher of Executive Intelligence Review, and Gary Kanitz, who is a farmer from upstate New York and is also acting as a campaign manager for Diane's campaign. So we'll go right to Diane, who will open it up, and then she'll introduce the subsequent speakers. Diane?
Great. Thanks very much, Dennis. So as everyone watching this knows, we are in a kind of period of suspended animation and great tension as President Trump, who gave a remarkable address 2 nights ago on his fight for the republic. As he said, he has no problem losing an election if he actually lost, but it's very clear, I think, that he did not lose the election and that there was massive fraud and all kinds of shenanigans. And we have thousands of people coming forward with signed affidavits on the irregularities and really bold operations which occurred. And even though Attorney General Barr has sort of folded, as was suspected or expected, since he didn't bring any indictments for the crimes behind the instigators of Russiagate and the whole witch hunt that's been going on for 4 years. Nonetheless, the president is fighting because what he represents is the 75 or 80 million Americans who voted for him and the interests of the republic. And the point of this is that such an election should never happen again. This is a fundamental question. If you're going to have representative government, then the right to vote is sacrosanct. And you can see how lightly this is taken by the secretaries of state, for example, in every state, who were sent a letter by Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebe, former NSA officials, telling each of them that they had devised a program whereby the states could have fraud-free elections, and not one single Secretary of State responded. So I think that says a lot right there. Now, the backdrop for this is what Lyndon LaRouche warned of, and his wife Helga Zepp-LaRouche warned of in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, and really in 1988 when Mr. LaRouche gave a historic address at the Kempinski Hotel in Berlin. And he said the time has come for the reunification of Germany, that the Soviet bloc is bankrupt. There are terrible shortages of food and other basic necessities. And he made a proposal that in return for the West feeding Poland, that the Soviet Union should allow Germany to be reunified. Many of us at that time thought this was a pretty wild thing for an American presidential candidate, particularly one who had just been indicted by none other than Robert Mueller, to be making such a proposal. But in fact, exactly what LaRouche proposed, that is the reunification of Germany. The Berlin Wall was down 1 year later, and Germany was reunified 2 years after this amazing address. LaRouche himself was in prison, put there by exactly the same forces that have been going after the Trump presidency, and for the same reasons, which is the potential to transform the world along the lines of what Franklin Roosevelt envisioned should be the post-colonial world at the end of World War II. Now, what LaRouche and his wife warned people at the time is they said, look, the fact that the communist system has failed does not mean that the British liberal free trade system is solvent, that system is also bankrupt, and they forecast a revolution in the coming months. It's taken a number of years. I don't think anyone could quite have predicted the amazing array of, it's almost like opium-induced fantasy bubbles that could be created. But that system is now really at its end, and there is a kind of revolutionary process. Remember, you had 17 intelligence agencies deployed to get Hillary Clinton elected in 2016. It didn't work. You had the Brexit vote just prior to that election. And what you see now around this fight is you have millions of Americans in the streets demonstrating for their right to representative government. And there's really a very big fight going on. But what I want to do is to give people a sense of what's behind this fight. And I wanted two people, Paul Gallagher, and later you'll hear from my campaign manager, Gary Kanitz, to give you a picture of what's happening with this financial system, what these central bankers are resorting to, why they need nothing less than a total dictatorship to ram through their policies and how they plan to do that. So I think I'll leave it right there and turn it over to Paul Gallagher, who is the economics editor and editorial board member of LaRouche's publication, Executive Intelligence Review.
Okay, thank you very much, Diane. If we're going to be a republic, and if we're going to keep the republic, as Benjamin Franklin said, we're going to have to get control and keep sovereign control of our currency and of our credit and our ability to generate credit for new economic activity in the country. That means, as you're indicating, that we're going to have to win a very large fight with the central banks of the United States, Europe, and Japan. Not just with the Federal Reserve. President Trump has had his battles with the Federal Reserve. In that alone, he's indicated just how unusual a president he has been, that he's been willing to take on the Federal Reserve, at times intimidate its chairman out of doing things that chairman wanted to do. But this is not just a matter of the Federal Reserve Bank. This is since the 2008 crash, the 2007-8 global financial crisis and crash, these biggest major central banks have been acting effectively as a more and more cohesively as a cabal, essentially attempting to dictate economic activity, not simply to manipulate interest rates and the values of currency, but to actually determine economic activity within these countries, including our country. And this, their purpose now is to force to accrue additional power. One of the ways that they are doing this, which I'm going to discuss in the course of the hour, is by, and people have been hearing a great deal about this lately, is by going to digital central bank currencies, digital versions run by the central banks of the dollar, the euro, the yen, and so forth. That's a very complicated subject. It's a means to them. It's simply a means by which they intend to force economic activity into the Green New Deal. It's a way of enforcing what in Europe they call the Green Deal, what the World Economic Forum calls the Great Reset, all meaning the same thing, forcing investment and forcing economic activity into backward technologies on the idea that we are overusing the resources of the planet. We have to sacrifice our economic activity to save the planet. They are moving to be the drivers which force investment to stop into coal, into oil, into petrochemicals, into all the associated industries that are dealing with fossil fuels. Stop investment into them, effectively shut them down, beginning with the coal power industry worldwide, and force investment instead in the opposite direction into green energy technologies and into throwbacks, into backwardness. This is obviously extremely dangerous. We're going to have to stop them from doing that. And on this, the only defense is a good offense. which I'll get to later. But since this is a complicated subject, for now, let me just say one thing. Let me just refer to a situation going on immediately now, which people have been perhaps following. Over the course of the last year, the Federal Reserve has been printing huge amounts of money, almost $4 trillion in new currency overall for what's called quantitative easing. It started out in February and March, trying effectively to buy every bond and stock in the world, because at least all of those denominated in dollars, because they were all collapsing in value. The banks were threatened by that. The Wall Street and London banks to save them is its mandate, and therefore it was throwing trillions at them. But at a certain point in March, the Congress passed a relief bill, a large relief bill against the pandemic. And they put in it, and this was unusual, $450 billion taxpayers' dollars to be turned over to the Federal Reserve. Why? So that obviously the Federal Reserve, in bailing out the banks by buying all these falling stocks and bonds, dollar-denominated stocks and bonds, Federal Reserve was going to lose money over the course of the year, 2 years, 3 years. Essentially, the Congress was offering the Federal Reserve $450 billion to cover what they were going to lose in bailing out the London and Wall Street banks in this way. And a certain small portion of that was supposed to be used to back up real lending. So the Federal Reserve claimed it was going to do real lending, or at least it was going to guarantee, your JP Morgan Chases and your Citigroups and so forth, if they did real lending to small businesses, payroll protection loans, if they bought the new bonds of municipal states and cities and so forth, if they did this useful kind of what they called Main Street lending, then the Federal Reserve would back them up in doing that. And the Congress, in turn, was backing up the Federal Reserve with all this money in case they took losses in doing that. But of course, what happened is the Wall Street banks didn't do any of this lending. They didn't do any PPP lending. They didn't do any buying of municipal securities. They didn't do any so-called Main Street lending. They weren't having any of it. So the money that was given to the Federal Reserve to back this up just sat there all year, unused. All these, if you look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet now, 99.3% of its 7.2 trillion in assets are securities. And the loans that they've backed up, those constitute 0.7% of that $7.2 trillion. So you see, they didn't do it. And at a certain point, a few weeks ago, President Trump told his Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, claw that money back, that most of that $450 billion. And he did it. And there were howls from the Federal Reserve, howls from the Biden camp, who really yelled much louder than the Federal Reserve itself, howls from Wall Street, you can't do this is wrong. We need the Federal Reserve in order to get us through the terrible winter, and so on and so forth. Trump wasn't hearing any of that. He clawed the money back. What happened? Immediately, a bipartisan group of senators appeared and said, well, we've got a $908 billion COVID relief bill number 4. We've all agreed on it. And one thing led to another in the last few days, and now it looks like this thing is probably going to be passed. Even stingy Mitch McConnell apparently is going to go along, and this thing is something like it. It's going to be passed. The only thing that made that possible is the money that Mnuchin, on Trump's orders, clawed back from the Federal Reserve. Fully half of that $908 billion is not going to have to be taxed by the Congress. It's not going to have to be borrowed by the Treasury. The Treasury already has it. And that is what made this fourth relief bill possible. Now, that gives you an idea of just how distant from the American population and from American business the Federal Reserve and its so-called credit issuance is. Nothing. It's not even touching state governments, city governments, the federal government in any significant way. It certainly does not touch the local producer, the household, in any way whatsoever. This is credit which is so far from the producer and the user that it is useless to the economy. This is what the central banks do. When what is necessary is to have a national bank, to nationalize the Federal Reserve, make it a national bank. Now, what does a national bank do? Its function is to bring credit close to the producer, the household, the agency which organizes infrastructure building and so forth. And the most important way in which it brings credit close to them is through the commercial banks. To give you one big example, if we have a national bank and it's committed to the rapid development of new infrastructure and our building back our economy, it's not going to provide the budget for the space agency. Congress has to do that. What the national bank is going to do is make large long-term loans to SpaceX. And you see what SpaceX has been doing. Now, in this case of SpaceX, it happened that its founder made a fortune otherwise when he was quite young and invested it all in SpaceX and Tesla. But there's many other potential SpaceX companies that are out there that are going to work with the space agency in the Moon-Mars mission, in returning to the moon, developing it by the 2030s, beginning to land on Mars. Many SpaceXs are going to participate in that. All of them are going to need to be borrowing money either from the national bank or even more so from their own banks with the support of a national bank. What a national bank is essentially a great big commercial bank, which works with private commercial banks all over the country to make sure that credit is available locally close to the producer, the contractor, the agency that needs it. And it does exactly the opposite of what the central banks do with credit, which is to secrete it somewhere up in the heavens and throw it all on Wall Street, on the City of London, on Frankfurt, at the big banks. That essentially is the battle that we're waging. This is our alternative to what they're doing. And it happens that what they're using now as a means is something that people have not heard of before: central bank digital currencies. And many people read about this and they say, oh, this must mean we're going to have a cashless society, or this has to do with buying things entirely without cash. That's not what it has to do with. What it has to do with is giving the central banks complete power over the currency and the creation of credit worldwide, effectively eliminating commercial banks entirely over a period, I would say no more than 4 to 5 years at most, probably much more quickly than that, eliminating commercial banks entirely, so that all investment is money being thrown from these central banks at the big investment banks, your JP Morgan Chases, your Morgan Stanleys, those investment banks, in order to determine who with a thimble actually gets this credit, and to tell them exactly what they have to do with it, so that the central banks then have complete control over which direction the economy goes. This is a disaster waiting to happen. And it's exactly why we have to take sovereign control back of our currency and our credit, starting by nationalizing our central bank and making it the kind of a large commercial bank, working with all the commercial banks in the country to make credit available everywhere for all kinds of new economic activity. This idea is the one of a man who's become quite famous lately, but not at all understood. Alexander Hamilton, our first Treasury Secretary, essentially the inventor of both the commercial bank and the national bank. And what a dividend this country has gotten for 250 years from the life of that man. That's where our alternative comes from. So I'm going to stop at that for now, and I'd like to hear from Gary of your campaign and his work and so forth.
Gary, maybe you should. Gary, for people who don't know, I said is my campaign manager. He's up in DeKalb Junction, and he runs a small farm. And one of the aspects of this great reset, or what Paul is describing, is absolutely to destroy agriculture and industry. And farmers are under attack. I know in Germany, farmer parents were saying their children are being denounced in school for being insect destroyers. I mean, it's just really unbelievable. Having fertilizer, developing the land are all considered crimes against the environment. And then you have these large financial interests taking over food supply, production, packaging, everything else. And we'll be discussing this more. But Gary, why don't you tell us the situation as you are dealing with it yourself?
Okay. So, well, just a couple of things to put that all to bring my context to it, I guess. One thing I wanted to say, just first of all, more generally, one of the things that I really think is critical, just with Diane's campaign in general, is going to be the issue of bringing New York State together, because as most people know, I mean, you have the whole city area, and then you have rural New York. When I was younger, high school age and whatnot, the area where I am now, which is closer to the Canadian border than to New York City, but so very rural. There were small 50 to 100, 200 cow dairies all over the place. I worked on several of them when I was young and so forth. So most of those have essentially completely disappeared. They're not there anymore. There are a few dairies around. They're mostly 1,000 cow and up operations. So anyway, what I'm getting at with that is the issue of getting some kind of conception between the people here of the importance of how, like, I used to see the city as a center of production and material activity and high technology activity and things of that sort. I was probably over optimistic as to how much of that was going on even then, but that is the way, that is the role that New York essentially, in terms of the city side, has to take on, and the people there need to have some kind of conception of, you know, what goes on in the rest of the state. So I just wanted to put that out there, that I think one of the critical things about Diane's campaign is this ability to bring these two very, very, very disparate aspects of New York State together, and specifically around a national and international program for how to address these issues with the kinds of policy ideas like Paul is presenting. Because, like, when you look at the local agricultural situation, essentially the economy of it is effectively a madhouse. There is no solution outside of a complete reorganizing of the system. Just to give a little bit of specific kind of view of a couple of things. Nationally, what's considered the inventory of beef cattle, which is the main thing I deal with in very small numbers right now. The national inventory is somewhere in the order of a little over 94 million head of cattle. Now, what I just went through, I knew kind of a vague idea, but I looked up a couple of statistics just so I'd have some numbers to throw out. The average herd size for those cattle is about is a little over 43 cows per herd. So think about that. That's a very small number. Those are small farms. Now, there are about 9.9% of the operations that have over 100 cows. But among that, essentially 10% of the national beef herd, that accounts for 56% of the total national herd. So those some percentage of that 10% are very, very large farms. But again, that just again puts in perspective of the other 40 some percent of those farms under 100 cows. You're actually looking at a vast number of them that are much smaller than even the 40 some cow national average. So people can often get the idea, well, yes, if you lose a few of these small farmers here and there, it's not really that big of a crisis, but you're actually talking about over 40% of the national beef supply. Well, really, over 90% of it is on cows, on farms that are less than 100 cows. So anyway, just to give a little perspective there of, on the one hand, the farms that are very large are effectively too large and create a food security issue that if you get problems in those kind of farms, you can lose 10-20% of the national supply of beef practically overnight. And then on the other side, the farms that are being disregarded as unimportant and it's not really essential that they make a profit or whatever, that still represents a significant part of the national supply. So that's just one thing I wanted to put out there. Just a little context in terms of what the kind of difficulties the individuals are facing. Again, I just want to kind of compare some of the issues on these vastly large farm operations to the smaller ones. Pretty much everything in the categories of dairy, poultry, and most grain production at this point is in these huge operations. And what goes on with that? Again, a couple of different things. One, there's the food security side of it, because again, if you have infectious problems on the animals on those farms or in the crops or whatever, you lose one or two operations and you lose a huge percentage of the food supply. But there's another element of it, which again goes at this issue of the banking side of the equation, which is that essentially these farms are run by the banks, and you get to a certain point in that where the farmers themselves are not really farmers. They're essentially an extension of the bank. So what they do is they try to get the maximum volume of product for the lowest possible cost, the obvious kind of considerations there. But what happens is that the larger and larger these farms get, then the percentage of profit per, whether it's a bushel of corn or 100 weight of milk, that's required to just be the nominal profit of the farm business is a smaller and smaller amount. So then if you try to go back to small and medium-sized farms or something, and again, I'm very much for relatively larger high-tech operations and using all the technology we have. But when you get into these mega operations, you create a situation where the profit percentage per unit, again, whether it's bushels or hundreds of gallons of milk or whatever, is so small that if a small or medium-sized farm tried to continue to exist on that same profit per 100 pounds of milk or bushel of corn or hundreds of chickens, they sell the poultry by the thousands now to a large extent. It's not possible, because what a household, just a single household requires to survive, you would need to have these larger number of animals because the profit margin per animal is so small. Then there's another whole element of it, which is specific like to the case here of being a small beef farmer, where if you try to sell animals through isolated auction houses, you have a very small number of buyers that represent the big packing houses, who then in turn package the meat and sell it to the major retailers. Those buyers basically have a coordinated capability, a bit of a racket, frankly, where you take the animals to the sale barn and they basically have a preset agreement of what they're going to pay per animal. I had an example we were talking about a little earlier, a cow that I'd sent to the local sale barn, a very nice Hereford cow. I had the actual sale ticket there from the, I don't know, probably can't see that, but I'll just give you the essential numbers. But like that was just a single cow that I'd sent individually. This was back in July of this year, and the cow weighed 1,130 pounds. I got $550 for the cow. Again, now I would have had the option to try to bid the cow back in, bring it back home. I wasn't in a position to do that at the time. So, but the fact is, essentially, they set up and said, "Oh yes, we're going to have a beef sale. Bring your beef cows. We'll get the buyers from the local packing houses, and they'll compete over buying the cows." There were almost no buyers at the sale, other than just a few local other farmers. So essentially, the auction house itself ended up buying that particular cow. So, so that's one element of it. Then you can often get a better price for an animal by selling it to people locally. Essentially, you'd send the animal through a packing house directly, and so that it can be packaged, USDA certified. The customer picks up the meat directly from the packer. So you can sell somebody a quarter cow, half cow, whatever. They get the cuts arranged with the butcher the way they want them. So you can get a decent price that way. But now what has happened is that the packing houses themselves are so few and far between and so overrun that right now, if you try to schedule sending an animal through those packing houses, you're essentially looking at a year or more delay, which means then, of course, you have to schedule it. So while that kind of situation can be helpful for individual farmers to try to get a little bit better margin so they can continue to supply food to the population, it's not a practical scenario at this point where you can actually coordinate that effectively. In fact, like in my local area, the local extension office is now coordinating meetings to try to help convince more people to set up more packing houses. So those are just kind of an overview of some of the issues that people are facing in the attempt to produce the food that we need. So I think I'll leave that at that. And if people have questions that, want to go into some other element of that, we can talk about it after.
Okay, I guess what the first thing would be then, Diane, you'd probably want to have some kind of a discussion among the panelists. Let me just say one thing that I think is relevant here. If you look at the issue of unifying New York State, you're certainly looking at the idea of production, bringing production back to New York. That's really an issue for the United States, but Alexander Hamilton's Treasury Secretaryship was devoted to this. He was establishing, of course, in partially the Society for Useful Manufacturers, which founded the city of Jersey City, did things over in Paterson, New Jersey as part of this, because it was all seen as one single productive area. Of course, it was the Port of New York, there was manufacturing, there was the Erie Canal, and there was the idea of mechanized agriculture. So that was New York was only viable as a productive unit. I think a lot of people may not realize that until the 1960s, the mid 1960s, there were 1 million workers. I'm talking here about industrial workers, people working in small shops, even for that matter, meat packing and so forth. Like that was all done down by the docks in New York into the early 60s, even a little bit later. So the idea of where we go in the context of the present crisis a crisis in which we're hearing about a Green New Deal. We're hearing about an incoming administration that's talking about cutting back, in a sense, in essence, on the fundamental productive powers of the United States, including in energy, for example, in New York State, with the probable shutdown of Indian Point nuclear power plant, thus subtracting about 20 to 25% of the area's electrical capacity. Uh, I'd like to just get a sense from, maybe you want to start off, Diane, about how you think of your campaign and think about these dialogues as supplying for people the necessary ideas that they can fight back against a kind of rollback of the United States Constitution's general welfare clause, which is what you're seeing happening not only around the election itself, but around the economy and the kind of thing that Paul outlined.
Okay, well, just for starters, I would say that one of the main aspects of my campaign that I should emphasize is, why have we tolerated the way we are living? The United States is supposedly the largest economy in the world, yet we have massive problems with poverty, with infrastructure. I'm curious to know from Gary what it costs to actually raise a cow to the point of being 1,100 pounds, how many years you had it or months you had it, and you're getting paid $500 and something for it. I imagine that could be below the cost of even getting a cow to that point. But if you take, for example, New York City, which Gary mentioned, the COVID pandemic really only made visible a crisis that's been in the making since at least 1975, when the Municipal Assistance Corporation came in and took over the functions of government under the bankers, as Paul is talking about happening now globally. And what you see now is that probably over 400,000 people have left the city. There's been massive budget cuts because of a shortage of tax revenue. People can't pay their property taxes because their tenants are not paying. The businesses are going under. They've stopped paying their rents, and the trash is piling up. You have now rats in Central Park that are as large as Maine Coon cats, practically, and homelessness, which, because of the need to separate people, they've taken a total of, I don't know, around 10,000 or so homeless people, another 3,500 people who were released early from the prisons, people, many of whom don't have the skills or ability to live on their own, and put them in luxury hotels around the city, and you have just incredible instability. And I think that we shouldn't live this way. It's completely outrageous. It's totally unnecessary. You could have taken the COVID pandemic as an opportunity to say, look, we're going to have to build extra additions onto all of our schools to have more space for the students. Construction jobs are outdoors, so that you're not going to have a high rate of transmission of disease. We could have taken people and employed them helping with basic sanitation. There's a proposal by the LaRouche movement, Helga Zepp LaRouche, the Schiller Institute, which, Dennis, you've been working on directly, on the question of the global pandemic. Could we not train thousands of young people in the United States to learn at least certain basic skills in dealing with hygiene, basic medical training, to allow them to help both in the United States and also internationally, where you need personnel and you need people who know how to do this, and to arrest the spread of the disease at an early phase when you can deal with it, as opposed to letting it get to the point where we're out of hospital beds, out of ventilators, out of personnel, out of PPE. I mean, it's absolutely absurd that the United States finds itself in this position, and that the state of New York finds itself in the position that it's in. And I really love this idea of unifying the state, because between what you have in Manhattan, what you have with the farm country, and the high tech. I believe it's 157 or 167 companies that are producing components for the Artemis mission of NASA are based in New York. You have Long Island, uh, Brookhaven, Brookhaven National Labs, Grumman, many other companies that were involved in the Apollo mission and are involved in this. So it seems to me, in a sense, as Lyndon LaRouche conceived of it when he said the Manhattan Project, we could be an exemplar actually of how you pull the whole country together.
Paul, let me just ask you, and I know you're going to have something to say about this, but you had spent a lot of time obviously talking about the issue of banking, and obviously Wall Street, and not going up against Wall Street is one of the great mantras. As a matter of fact, preserving Wall Street is almost seen as a matter of national security by the wrong people. So just in terms of your own involvement in both, not only in terms of finances and so on, but also in terms of New York City, where you spent a lot of time. If you could say something about what you think about this idea of a unity process that could be utilized in the United States to bring the country into a fight against these predatory forces.
Paul, you're muted.
I see what Gary and Diane were discussing as, and what I started with is very coherent because you can really campaign, or you can really have a conception of credit to unify the economic development of New York State as a whole. Back in the period that Dennis is referring to, when I ran for local office in New York City a couple of times, and for the governorship once. These were very clearly third-party opposition campaigns, but we got to speak to and influence a lot of people around the state. One of the things we were focusing on at that time was the need to expand, although it has since been contracted, to expand the amount of nuclear power available for the power needs of the whole lower half of New York State, and to build additional nuclear power facilities upstate. That wasn't done, but that is one of the legs that a national bank could directly contribute to, as I would say the three legs of bringing this kind of development together. One of them is power, which is inadequate. A second, and it's inadequate really in most parts of the state, certainly in the urban areas of the state. It's inadequate to transportation. It's inadequate to a well-functioning public health and hospital system. It's inadequate to the school systems in places, and it doesn't provide power for many businesses, industrial businesses and others, which have tended to gradually disappear in the period of deindustrialization. So there's got to be a lot of construction of new power now at the frontiers of nuclear energy, small modular reactors. There's got to be, I think you could say in one sense of what Gary was talking about, there used to be not only a lot of small dairy farms and other farms, there used to be a lot of small meat lockers, local meat lockers, where butchering and processing of meat took place, again, close to the producer, which is the way the American system was supposed to work. And therefore, being able to do it relatively quickly for the producer and actually get more done than these huge meat packing plants get done, even, per man per day or per woman per day, getting more processing of meat done, considerably more per man day than these immense abattoirs do that recently have been the spreaders of COVID-19. So that's necessary in order that these farms can prosper on the level of high technology family farms. And that obviously that's being done in a few areas of the country in response to the shutdown of many of the biggest ones due to the pandemic. That's being done in a few places, but in order for it to really spread, that's going to take a lot of credit to local businesses that set that up, or local farm cooperatives that set that up. And then in the city, not only New York City, but in the cities of the state, but taking New York City as an example, you've had recently a real breakdown in recent years of the transportation system here. And this is a national problem. There are about 30 large metropolitan transportation systems in the country. All of them have been losing huge amounts of money during 2020, and now have started to make large layoffs, cut service out entirely on the weekends in many places. But nonetheless, an agency like the Metropolitan Transportation Agency in New York is absolutely creditworthy for a long-term capital loan from a national bank that would easily double its capital budget, which I think is about $30 billion every 5 years, could easily double that in a single loan in order to make a recovery and expansion and the necessary development out of the transportation system in the whole tri-state area around New York City. Same thing can be said for the New York City public school system and for the New York City public hospital system in particular, but also some of the leading private hospitals. Credit for expansion and for increased quality is necessary for all of these sort of three legs of restoring the economy of New York, and from not just from this pandemic, but from 50 years of deindustrialization at least. Restoring that, this is what it takes. So, in direct contrast to that, you have since last year at a big meeting in Wyoming of all the central bankers sponsored by the Federal Reserve, the most environmentalist radical of all the central bankers, the most greenest fanatic of them all, Mark Carney, who was then head of the Bank of England, said, oh, well, what we really need is to, in the next few years, bring about a global digital synthetic currency controlled by the central banks. And that currency has to replace the dollar completely as a reserve currency all around the world. And at the same meeting, other central bankers were saying we need a regime change. We need to take the power of spending that now belongs to national governments. We need to take it over ourselves as central banks, print the money, and in addition, determine what it is going to be spent on. And this can most easily be done with a central bank digital currency, as they call them. So that's the extreme which we have to stop. And it has up a great deal of momentum right now. And President Trump, again, he kept the Federal Reserve from daring to go near the so-called network for greening the financial system, which was started by this same Mark Carney, along with Mike Bloomberg, and which all the other big central banks belong to it, the network for greening the financial system, making sure that the investments go into big wind farms and smart grids, and nothing more advanced than that. And President Trump kept the Federal Reserve from even mentioning this network for greening the financial system. Now, in the last 2 weeks, thinking that he is gone, the head of the Federal Reserve announced they're joining the network for greening the financial system, along with the other all the other central banks. This is a fundamental part of the battle over the way in which this election has so far been stolen from the president, and the issues that are actually at stake.
Gary, you have anything you have to say in response to that? And if you don't, I have a question for you, but perhaps you have something.
Muted.
Muted.
Sorry about that. I was saying, actually, there. Are we good now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had another button pop up. So, actually, I have something very specific on that, and it goes back 4 or 5 years. Because I mean, one of the reasons my operation's as small as it is because essentially we're operating completely at a loss every year right now, with the strategy that we're spending what we can to accumulate the equipment, facilities, the animals, the feed, everything we need to create the operation, essentially with no credit. And we had looked into the possibility of getting credit. Like I said, I think 5, 6 years ago, maybe it was only 4. There's an organization called the Farm Services Agency, and their mission is nominally to give low interest loans to support agriculture, and it can be very small amounts. I mean, they can consider a micro loan up to $500,000 or something. So that's their idea of a micro loan. So anyway, one of the things that came up, what we were looking at was actually getting an investment in a few hundreds acres. We're operating only on about 40 right now, and then other land that I do a free lease on for cutting the hay for feed. But the idea was to expand to try to get into the realm of around 80 cows. And that would have meant we'd need the cash up front for buying the property, purchasing the plant, the more modern equipment than we're operating with, or at least larger equipment, so that we could efficiently get a sufficient pasture area fenced and be able to harvest the feed necessary, and get a certain starter herd up front. So all those costs. Now, we were denied on a couple of levels on that, but the essential thing that I got out of it, and which is probably why I will probably not try that again, although we'd probably have much better luck with it now if I did. When they say, okay, we'll finance this, if you buy right now any property at all with government funding, you cannot hardly so much as cut the grass without getting a special study done on the environmental impact of what activity you've done. In the case of the property we were looking at the time, there were numerous drainage pathways which had gradually filled in over time, just natural ditches and things that flowed through the pathways, through the property, small streams and such. And with the harvesting of the fields adjacent to those, the ground sort of sinks in, and eventually you don't have proper drainage anymore, and it's very difficult to get the crops off the field because they're too wet. So, I was suggesting, well, this isn't going to be a problem because we'll just dredge those out and reestablish the natural drainage that was there. And I mean, when I brought this up to the loan agent, she almost just, fell out of her chair that I would even suggest doing that without a proper environmental study first to see what all the impacts are. So just to give you a sense that at the very least that would do is it would be a huge additional cost to have the study done. And a major delay in time, where otherwise it's something you just take your backhoe or whatever piece of equipment you're using, you go out there and do it, and you solve your problem. So, and that's mild compared to the kind of things that are in the works at this point. So yeah, that's just one specific thing, and just 2 other things real quick on what Diane raised earlier. On the issue of the costs of the animals. One is the particular kind of operation I'm running is called a cow-calf operation. So my strategy is I'm basically breeding the cows here and having additional calves that are raised from birth, and then those can either be sold young as what are called feeders, which then go to a feedlot and get finished before resale, or I can raise them to finish size here. If I'm doing that with just like say I take a bull calf that's born, steer it very young, and then raise it up, you're basically talking anywhere from 90 cents to $1.20 a pound cost. And that's very minimal. And again, that's with me not paying loans or the kind of things that people do if they're out buying brand new tractors or something. So
Per year?
what's that?
You say 90 cents or $1 per pound per what unit of time?
Oh, that's just the amount of time to get the animal up into the range of 900 to 1,100 pounds, which
Okay.
is about 18 months to 2 years. So that's just if you're starting with the steers. Now with the cow situation, that's a slightly different situation. That animal was around 3 years old, which is about the oldest you want to be selling them for the regular market. But the purpose of keeping, so the cow, technically I probably had more invested in her, but the purpose of the cow was producing calves. Doesn't mean that her, carcass beef supply, which out of an 1,100 pound cow would be around probably 650, 700 pounds of actual usable meat. That's still high quality beef out of that animal. So there's no particular reason why it should be being sold significantly. It would be sold somewhat less than a premium price, but just to give you those numbers. But yeah, this issue of the green element in the financing of the real economy is something that's already been ongoing in various degrees, but that is absolutely going to have a devastating effect. The scale on which they're going to magnify it at this point with what's being proposed is just not even something you can really calculate.
We're pretty much, I think, up on time, but I have something I want to pose to everybody, and maybe we can make this respond and also make it sort of a final statement. And here's what it's about. One of our colleagues, Jerry Rose, has been calling attention to a book written by Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was formerly the Vice President of the United States under Franklin Roosevelt. He was also Agricultural Secretary, and he was Commerce Secretary. He worked together with Franklin Roosevelt for a very long time. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt was from New York State and became most famous for the New Deal, as well as his governance of the United States during the Second World War. But Wallace wrote a book in 1945 with the title 60 Million Jobs, 60, which I dare say would stun people in the United States right now if you propose that they needed to get 60 million jobs. This was at the end of the Second World War. And it was an idea for sustained growth of the United States and how you were going to take the war industries and convert them for peacetime production, and why you could achieve full employment in the United States economy at a productive wage. So the reason I want to ask about this is Green New Deal is not this. As a matter of fact, I'd say Franklin Roosevelt would never have supported the Green New Deal, just as I don't believe that either Biden or Bernie Sanders or AOC would actually support the New Deal. But just to ask, Gary, since you're the campaign manager, and clearly this idea of the relationship between the farm and industry and production is something that's at the core of Diane's whole campaign. How do you think this idea, Roosevelt's ideas, which I think are the same as what Diane is putting forward, how are you seeing, or how would you see the application of that outlook to addressing the problems that you've been talking about? And then I think we'll go to Paul after that, and then to Diane.
I mean, I would sum it up mainly as an issue of infrastructure. That the infrastructure projects that need to get built are where the bulk of that level of job creation can go on. And I mean, and of course getting this green element out of the finance decision making and giving people who are trying to actually be productive, a certain amount of free reign to function as they need to. Obviously, there needs to be some protections for things, but the way that's being done now is out of control. So, but the infrastructure projects that are going to be necessary, like for instance, if you did a massive buildup of these small meatpacking plants, just as a random example, there's no reason I can see that you couldn't have meatpacking plants that take in almost however much beef people are able to produce in a given area, or poultry, because again, that needs to be taken out of these massive million bird facilities and put back into something a little more in perspective. But these packing houses could be directly taking the meat in, and so they're purchasing directly from the farmer, and the farmers and then selling directly to the distributors. And then, you know, if there's direct marketing going on, that can go on kind of through a separate channel. But the idea that, you know, you collect animals in one area and then centralize them in these huge packing houses, and then so that involves moving things over large distances. But if you did that, if you said, well, we're going to package the meat locally and then ship it, you know, you're going to need a much more efficient transportation grid. You're going to need much more power density in an area for those packaging plants. I also just wanted to throw out, even though I'm up here in the middle of nowhere, within 15 miles of me, there's a Corning Canton plant, which I don't know their involvement in the Artemis project right now, but they were involved in making mirrors for the Hubble telescope and windows for the space shuttle back when I was in high school. Actually, a foster parent that I was living with at the time worked for them on those projects. But you have these kind of things spread all over the place. The ability of people to move efficiently from one thing to the other, get the work done. That's where you can have that kind of job creation. And one of Diane's favorite projects, the building the seawall down outside of, that's between Staten Island over toward Long Island, I think. Yes, crossing
from Sandy Hook in New Jersey to the Rockaways.
Oh, okay, so a little more ambitious.
5 miles long.
Yeah. So like obviously those kind of things, and the, you know, the flood control even on a small scale in areas like this. There's just the bridges. Every bridge in every bridge in New York State needs to get rebuilt. We just had a small a bridge over a river rebuilt here. That it took months, and I mean, this is something that should have been able to be done in a week or two. It was so I'm going on too much, but you get the gist of it, I think.
All right, very good. By the way, we got a couple of questions I guess I should reference. One was a comment, which is farm growth was astronomical during World War II under the direction of FDR. New York had over 20,000 farms as a result for the war. That's one comment that we made, and there were a couple of others which I seem to have lost as a result of the picture coming up. But Paul, why don't I go to you and see if you've got anything to say about that matter?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was because of the Farm Credit Corporation and the Rural Electrification Administration, which really made it possible for the productivity of farms to grow tremendously. And it was 60 million jobs that that Wallace was looking at, writing just as the demobilization of 16 million people in the armed forces was going on at the end of the war, or out of the armed forces. And you can look at that now in a very comparable way, but you have to understand that Roosevelt, to comment on your comment, Dennis, about Roosevelt would not support the Green New Deal, he absolutely wouldn't. His focus was on, and those who worked with him, like Harry Hopkins and others, Harold Ickes, their focus was on productive projects which would increase the productivity of the workforce as a whole. TVA, that was something that Henry Ford wanted to buy the whole Muscle Shoals area and do something with it, but Henry Ford didn't really know what he wanted to do with it. And the private power companies who operated near that area didn't want any such thing as the development of a TBA to be done. Roosevelt did it nonetheless. It was one of the very first, it was probably the very first major project that he started, aside from the Hoover Dam, which was already being constructed when he came in. Productivity was incredibly increased, as well as the energy density that the average person, farmer or worker, had to work with in that entire area of the United States. And in terms of energy, electrical energy for the entire United States, it transformed things. That was what was in Roosevelt's eye, and not, on the other hand, there was a project which kept being pushed in the early New Deal, a very large geothermal power project for the waters around the coasts of the New England states. FDR had a good look into that and had people look into it, and then canceled it after it had already been granted some New Deal funding because it was low productivity, worse than low productivity. It wasn't going to work. So that although he was a conservation-oriented president, that's how he described himself. And remember, he started the planting of that huge green belt of trees against the dust storm, the Dust Belt. Nonetheless, productivity was always in his mind. And Harold Ickes and Harry Hopkins raising productivity. It's the opposite of a dismal Green New Deal of sacrificing human invention to the planet. So that's what we have to think about in terms of a national bank credit and the development of jobs. We have right now, not 60 million, but more than 20 million effectively unemployed in this country. About 18 million of them absolutely unemployed, who were in informal employment, gig employment, very small business employment before the COVID pandemic hit, and have been unemployed ever since. And we're looking at a need for productive employment on the order of 25 million immediately, that is, in a year or two, and 50 million over a generation. We published a program, which I know that Diane and her campaign have embraced, that program that we published in May through EIR to create those 50 million jobs. And as part of creating 1.5 billion jobs worldwide through these kind of great projects, and also the immediate projects of hospitals and clinics to treat people in the pandemic, development of food production in underdeveloped areas, and also just emergency distribution of food in many places now. These things are all going to be discussed in a week's time at the Schiller Institute's Grand Conference next Saturday and Sunday. That kind of job creation with the eye totally on raising productivity while you're doing it and saving human lives at the same time. That's what we have to think of in terms of 50 or 60 million jobs. And I know that Harry, in that book, 60 Million Jobs, he quotes Alexander Hamilton. And he quotes the part where Alexander Hamilton is talking about the future, and that when you have new innovations, really new inventions, normally businessmen are very cautious, he says, and those involved in trade and so forth, they don't really go near that right away because they're unfamiliar with it. And that is where a national credit institution steps in and says, this is the future and we are going to fund it. So he also, Henry Wallace does, he also has that in his book, and it's a very important touch to what he's presenting as a whole. That's what I would say.
Okay, very good. Just want to thank the people that have asked questions, and also there's a lively chat discussion going on there about various matters of agriculture. We want to really thank everybody for being involved with that. And before we go to our final statement from Diane, we'll be responding to this question and taking us out. Let me just point out that, as Paul said, there will be a 2-day conference next Saturday and Sunday. It starts at 9 a.m. 4 panels done by the Schiller Institute. And I guess we'll put something up on it. But the basic idea of the conference is the world at a crossroads, and what it is that would constitute an American approach to then addressing an international crisis, and how Americans play a role in seeing that international crisis as the moment for recommitting, if you will, to the tradition, the truer tradition of the American system and the American Revolution. And I think really a lot of what we're doing in this campaign, and what you're even hearing here, goes to reacquainting a starving audience with a lot of the ideas that become essential for our political life today. We're past slogans, and we're past a lot of the kind of sound bites. I think people recognize that. And I just want to say that everybody's invited. You can go to the Schiller Institute website. I guess we'll put something up maybe at the end that has all the information, or I'll grab it in between. And so, Diane, maybe you should now take the opportunity to wind us up.
Sure. Well, on this question of 60 million jobs, or jobs in general, part of the problem is the people who are employed are misemployed. That is, LaRouche used to describe this when he talked about the Great Depression. He used this idea of, quote, taking in each other's laundry. And what it means is there's not any productive work, there's not careers, but people all come up make work, or you have these apps. So there's an app, you can find a babysitter, you can find a dog walker, you can find an Uber or a Lyft. And the problem with this is you have to say, well, what is the difference between a human being and an animal? A human being is creative. Human beings change their life, they change their existence through their mind. That is, you make a discovery. We've created an artificial environment. Everyone who is watching this, first of all, has somehow access to the internet or satellite data. You have some kind of electricity or power. These are not things that were occurring naturally, but were harnessed because a human being made a discovery. So far, you do not see dogs or even monkeys successfully using smartphones or even cooking their food. So when you think about the development of mankind, what you would seek to do is those things that allow human beings to be more creative, to be more like human beings, as to being more like animals. And what do I mean by that? Well, think about, again, if you think about New York City, what happens in New York City? You have, I don't know, tens of thousands of couriers, because what are they doing? They're bringing everybody's food, their newspapers. You order things, you have Amazon.com, and you have all these poor people running around on their bicycles or running around by foot to bring all this stuff to people. Well, that's not really human labor. And frankly, I don't think that an animal should be doing that either at this point. What about, can you imagine if we had the power, we certainly have the data, if you had a pneumatic tube system all over New York City, and you order food at a restaurant and you program it and it goes in the tube and it pops up in your building in 20 minutes and it's still hot, and there's something on your phone that has the code that allows you to get the right dinner and not someone else's, and it's secure. Why don't we have that? The speed of an average freight train in the United States right now is 17 miles per hour. Trains go slower today on average in the United States than they did 50 years ago. This is insane. And people say, oh, but if you had automatic computerized delivery through pneumatic tubes, wouldn't all these people lose their jobs? Well, maybe those people would become nuclear physicists, biochemists. Maybe they would have time to practice the violin. Maybe there is someone who is an extraordinary basso profundo who's right now running around delivering pizzas in New York City, who could be making a great contribution to mankind with the development of that voice. And therefore, it's not just jobs per se, but it's the right jobs that allow human beings to be fully human. If you think about the fact that there might be 22 trillion galaxies, then what is going to be the creative effort of human beings to figure out how to explore our solar system, our galaxy, the universe? There's more than enough to go around for many lifetimes of the people here on this planet. And that's what should be fostered, and what Alexander Hamilton was a genius at, and Lyndon LaRouche really, in a sense, brought this to a new level, is how do you create an economic credit system which materializes in a physical domain that allows each human being to develop their creative talent to the maximum capability. And that's what we really have to be fighting for.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Diane. I just want to say to everybody, to the entire panel, yourself, to Gary Kanitz, and to Paul, I think what we've now done is to give people not just a lot to think about, but a very specific perspective on how in the next, really actually next weeks, it's possible to put forward, inclusive by means of this campaign, an alternate perspective to what will otherwise become a very pessimistic season. I mean, we have this now, we're talking about a second wave of the coronavirus. There's a forecast of 150,000 more Americans dying. And even if you talk about the idea of a release of a vaccine and everything else, clearly it's a winter of discontent. And so the ability to project functional optimism, including people fighting against the fraud of the United States election, and doing it in a way which is actually going to be productive. This is going to be a very important element, I think, of to moralize people. I just want to again announce this conference, which will be next Saturday. We'll also be talking about it, I guess, next week. It's called The World After the United States Election, Creating a World Based on Reason. It is sponsored by the Schiller Institute. You can go to that site that you see there, the International Schiller Institute, at the top left of your screen, and register for it. It will begin at 9 a.m. on Saturday morning, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that next week, next Friday, prior to that program. So we want to now just say that we want to thank everybody for joining us. We hope that you learned something that you'll find more than useful. If there's anything that I forgot, Diane, do you want to now have anything else to say to people?
I think that's it. I will remind people that tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the Schiller Institute, there will be a dialogue of Harley Schlanger and our colleague Jacques Cheminade, who has run for president of France, I think 3 times, who was also the target of an incredible witch hunt, which is finally now coming to light. And I think will give people a lot of insight as to what's happening in the United States. So I'd encourage people to join me and Dennis Speed tomorrow at 2 o'clock for that. And then this conference, we should just get the word out far and wide. It's very, very important. And in the meantime, if you're in Pennsylvania or have friends in any of these states where these battles are going on, Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, etc., let's get the calls into the state legislature and on the election and the votes being properly counted and the cases heard and justice being done to uphold the principle of one person, one vote in this country.
All right, so very good. So on behalf of New York Symposium with Diane Sayre, good night, and we'll see you next week.